Harlan Wicks had engineered his life for maximum predictability. It was a project he'd undertaken with the same quiet diligence he once applied to bird watching, a discipline of observation and patience. His house, a perfect 40-foot square set deep in a piney holler in the western timberlands of Ashley County, was the primary instrument of this control. Around the central living space, he'd built an interior porch, a 3-foot wide track for walking his morning circles, insulated from the oppressive humidity of summer and the damp chill of winter. Encircling that was an exterior porch, a mirror of the first, for the rare, perfect days when the Arkansas weather deigned to cooperate. Harlan was a planner, and he would not have his constitutional interrupted by something as dumb as weather. This morning, however, marked the end of a different kind of long walk. He sat at his small kitchen table, a cup of black coffee steaming beside him, and looked at the final coupon from his fingerhood payment book. For 54 months, a small but irritating portion of his pension had been diverted to this single cause, a state-of-the-art stereo system. It was a magnificent, gleaming stack of silver-faced components that promised to fill his meticulously ordered world with the pure, untroubled sound of his record collection. He wrote out the check for $66, slid it and the coupon into the envelope, and sealed it with a decisive lick. It was done. His only companion, General Beauregard, a bantam rooster with an imperious posture and plumage the color of a sunset, hopped onto the table and let out a soft, interrogative cluck. "That's it, General," Harlan said, scratching the bird's comb. "We are now the sole and undisputed owners of that fine piece of audio equipment. A moment like this calls for a celebration." He went to the cupboard, pulled out a bag of popcorn kernels, and poured a generous amount into the pot on the stove. Soon the rhythmic popping filled the quiet house, a sound of miniature contained explosions that Harlan found deeply satisfying. He poured the fluffy white mounds into a large wooden bowl, sat in his favorite armchair, and placed the bowl on the floor between him and the rooster. General Beauregard pecked at a piece, his sharp eyes fixed on Harlan. With the celebratory popcorn underway, Harlan walked to the stereo. He selected a record, a pristine copy of a classic country album he'd been saving for this very occasion. He slid the vinyl from its sleeve, placed it on the turntable with practiced care, and lowered the needle. Music filled the room, but it was not the familiar twang of a steel guitar. It was a shimmering, melancholic melody, carried by a clean electric guitar and a wistful voice. Harlan frowned. He lifted the needle and dropped it again. The same song started from the beginning. He turned the receiver on and off. He switched the input to the radio, then to the tape deck, which held a dusty cassette of bird calls. Each time the same song emerged from the speakers, a song he vaguely recognized but couldn't place. It was a ghost in his new machine. His frustration mounted. He tried another record, then another. The result was always the same. The magnificent stereo system, the culmination of 4.5 years of fiscal discipline, was cursed. It would play only this one single infuriating song. He slumped back into his chair. The joy of the morning curdled into bewilderment. General Beauregard hopped onto his knee, and together they listened to the endlessly repeating lament. It was a song he would soon learn called Half-Light, by a band called Two Man Dandy, and it was, for the foreseeable future, the soundtrack to his life. The next morning began, as all of Harlan's mornings did, before the sun had troubled itself to climb over the loblolly pines that crowded his holler. He sat on his interior porch, the raw wood cool beneath his bare feet,
and performed his ritual. From a small baggie provided weekly by his nephew Tommy Don, the proprietor of the county's finest dispensary, he took a pinch of a strain called Yuck Mouth. He packed it into the bowl of a small pipe and took 6 small, precise puffs. Not 5, not 7, 6. It was the correct dosage, calibrated over years of experimentation to smooth the jagged edges of the world without dulling his senses. He followed it with a long swallow of black coffee from a thick ceramic mug. He sat watching the dark shapes of the trees slowly separate themselves from the night. The cursed music from the stereo, which he'd forgotten to turn off, played softly in the living room, the same wistful tune over and over. He sighed. He was still trying to figure out the twilight. Was it the early morning or the early evening? The song seemed to suggest it was both, a state of being caught in between. He glanced at the digital clock on the stove. 6:05 a.m. He took another sip of coffee. At 6:06 a.m., the world glitched. It wasn't a sound or a tremor. It was a change in the very quality of the light. The pre-dawn gloom didn't brighten, it intensified. The green mist outside the window began to vibrate, to shimmer, and the colors within it bled into hyper-saturated, impossible hues. The deep green of the pines became a brilliant electric emerald. The brown of the damp earth turned to rich, glowing chocolate. It was as if someone had turned up the contrast on reality itself. Harlan froze, the mug halfway to his lips. He blinked, wondering if Tommy Don had mixed up his order. This was far beyond the gentle recalibration of Yuck Mouth. Then a voice spoke from beside him, a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in his bones. "You know, if we have to listen to this for the rest of our lives, I do hope it grows on us." Harlan turned his head slowly. General Beauregard was perched on the porch railing, not looking at Harlan, but at the shimmering woods. His beak hadn't moved, but the voice had come from him as surely as the crowing came from him at dawn. Harlan said nothing. He couldn't. His mind, usually a well-ordered file of bird calls and weather patterns, was a whirlwind of static. The rooster continued, his tone now that of a seasoned field commander. "There is a persistent environmental factor, annoying but not debilitating. Second, the visual anomaly." He cocked his head. "The world appears to have been repainted by a committee of enthusiasts with no sense of restraint. This suggests a fundamental alteration of local physics." Harlan stared at the rooster. The rooster. The talking rooster. He was having a stroke, or he was dreaming, or he was finally, irrevocably insane. The shimmering, hyper-real state persisted for what felt like an hour. Harlan and the rooster who called himself a tactical advisor, sat in silence, observing the vibrant, pulsating world outside. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The colors snapped back to their muted, normal tones. The mist ceased its vibration. The world was just the world again. Harlan looked at General Beauregard. The rooster blinked his beady eyes, ruffled his feathers, and let out a standard non-baritone cluck. He hopped off the railing and began pecking at an imaginary speck on the floor. He was just a rooster again. Harlan Wicks sat for a long time, the cold coffee forgotten in his hand. He was a man of science, of observation and predictable results. What he had just witnessed belonged to neither. It was a glitch in the holler, a crack in the world, and he was standing right on the edge of it.
The day passed in a fog of disbelief. Harlan walked his porches, inside and out, trying to reason his way back to solid ground. He checked the yuck-mouth baggie for any sign of contamination. He considered calling his doctor, then dismissed the idea. What would he say? My rooster gave me a tactical briefing this morning? By 4 o'clock, he was sitting on his front porch, a generic beer in his hand, when the familiar sound of a sputtering engine echoed down the gravel road. Randy John Sawyer and Josh Henry Might had arrived, as they did every afternoon, for their daily ritual of quiet contemplation and cheap lager. Randy, a portly man whose good nature was matched only by his thirst, plopped into a rocking chair. Harlan. Josh, lanky and taciturn, nodded from the steps. Harlan. They drank in silence for a few minutes. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the endless, looping melody of half-light drifting from inside the house. "Stereo still acting up?" Randy asked. "Still acting up," Harlan confirmed. He took a long pull from his beer, gathering his nerve. "Boys," he began, trying to sound casual, "I'd like to propose a scientific experiment." Randy raised an eyebrow. "Last time you proposed a scientific experiment, we spent 3 hours trying to teach a possum to play checkers." "This is different," Harlan insisted. "This is an observation. At 6:06 this morning, something peculiar happened. I want to see if it happens again at 6:06 this evening." Josh squinted at him. "What kind of peculiar?" Harlan hesitated. "A change in the light, in other things." Randy and Josh exchanged a look. They knew Harlan was eccentric, but this was a new level of vague. Still, they were his friends, and sitting on a porch waiting for something peculiar to happen was not fundamentally different than sitting on a porch waiting for nothing to happen. "All right, Harlan," Randy sighed. "We'll play along. What do we do?" "We just sit and watch." They sat. They drank their beer. They watched the sun dip below the pines, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The clock on Harlan's flip phone ticked toward the appointed hour. At 6:05, a nervous silence fell over the porch. At precisely 6:06 p.m., the Shimmer returned. The world snapped into its hyper-saturated cartoon state. The green of the forest became a riot of impossible shades. The light wasn't just evening light, it was a physical presence, thick and golden. Randy dropped his beer can, which clattered on the porch with a comical bunk sound effect. "What in the hell?" he breathed. Harlan looked at his friends. Randy was no longer just portly, his belly was a perfect bouncing sphere, his face simplified into a mask of wide-eyed astonishment. Josh's long, mournful face had become even longer, his limbs stretching and bending like rubber hoses. Harlan looked at his own hands. They were outlined in a thick black line, his fingers simplified into 4 digits like an old-timey cartoon character. "Well, I'll be," Josh said, his voice an octave higher and twangier than usual. "We're animated." General Beauregard hopped onto the railing, now looking less like a chicken and more like a noble feathered knight. "Gentlemen," he announced in his booming baritone, "the Shimmer. The preliminary tactical situation appears to be stable. No immediate threats detected." Randy John Sawyer stared at the talking rooster, then at his cartoon hands, and then at the pulsating, vibrant landscape. A slow grin spread across his simplified face.
The initial shock gave way to a chaotic, unrestrained glee. Josh discovered he could stretch his arms to an impossible length, reaching down to snatch a pine cone from 20 feet away. Randy found that if he jumped, he hung in the air for a moment before floating gently back down. They were no longer bound by the tedious laws of physics. They were a mystery crew, a trio of animated oddballs in a world that had gone wonderfully, beautifully mad. Harlan, ever the observer, tried to find the parameters of their new reality. He walked to the edge of the porch and tossed a bottle cap into the shimmering woods. Instead of arcing to the ground, it flew straight until it reached a certain point about 50 yards out and simply vanished with a soft pop. "Did you see that?" he called out. Randy, who was attempting to balance on one leg on top of a fence post, wobbled. "See what?" "It disappeared. There's an edge." Intrigued, they all walked to the spot. As they approached the edge of the clearing around Harlan's house, the world ahead grew hazy and indistinct, like a photograph left out in the sun. It was still there, the gravel road, the endless pines, but it looked distant, unreal. "It's like we're in a snow globe," Josh said, reaching a long, rubbery arm toward the boundary. His hand passed through, and for a moment it looked normal, a hand of flesh and bone in the real world's fading light, before he pulled it back into their vibrant reality. "A bubble," General Beauregard corrected from his perch on Harlan's shoulder. "A localized spatio-temporal distortion. We are inside. The rest of the world is outside. They cannot perceive us." "So we're invisible?" Randy asked, his eyes wide. "More accurately, we are operating on a different perceptual frequency. To an outside observer, we simply are not here. The minivan your sister left, Harlan, it is still sitting there, an inert object. But should we choose to enter it, it becomes part of the bubble with us." A thought occurred to Harlan, a planner's question. He pulled out his flip phone. The screen read 6:11 p.m. "How long does this last?" "Time is elastic in here," the general explained. "What might be 20 minutes in the exterior world can contain a full narrative arc for us. An entire adventure can transpire before the distortion collapses." They spent the rest of the shimmer testing the boundaries of their bubble. They ran to the edge of the holler, peering out at the mundane world like tourists at a strange exhibit. They discovered that objects from the real world could be brought into the bubble, but anything originating within the bubble could not be taken out. It was a one-way street. The laws were arbitrary, nonsensical, and utterly fascinating. When the shimmer finally ended, snapping them back to their normal gravity-bound selves in the deepening twilight, the three men stood in silence. The world felt muted, drab, a pale imitation of the vibrant reality they had just left. Harlan picked up his beer can, which now felt disappointingly solid. "So," he said, his voice back to its normal register, "same time tomorrow?" Harlan looked at his friends, at the quiet woods, at the first stars appearing in the sky. His predictable, well-ordered life had been shattered, and he had never felt more alive. Same time tomorrow.
For the next few days, the shimmer became their new ritual. At 6:06 p.m., the world would transform, and for a handful of real-world minutes that stretched into a luxurious, cartoonish hour, they would explore their bubble. They learned to coordinate their strange new abilities, with Josh acting as the lookout and retrieval expert, Randy as the surprisingly agile heavy lifter, and Harlan as the reluctant strategist, guided by the increasingly grandiose tactical pronouncements of General Beauregard. They were a team, albeit a team with no purpose. Their adventures were meaningless, confined to the borders of Harlan's holler. They were sitting on the porch after the shimmer had faded, nursing their beers and coming down from the high of their temporary godhood. Inside the house, the The stereo played on, a constant, melancholic backdrop to their new lives. Suddenly, the music warped. The clean guitar notes of Half-Light dissolved into a screech of static, a harsh electronic tearing sound that made them all jump. It was the first time the stereo had played anything different since the curse began. The static lasted for a few seconds, then it coalesced into a single piercing tone. And then a voice. It was feminine but digitized and clipped, like an old-fashioned telegraph transmission read by a machine. It spoke a short, cryptic phrase. Cross at light, 33 degrees, 4 minutes, 12.47 seconds north, 92 degrees, 4 minutes, 24.13 seconds west. Acknowledge. The voice repeated the message once more, then dissolved back into a shriek of static. A moment later, the familiar, gentle melody of Half-Light resumed, as if nothing had happened. The three men stared at the open doorway, at the stereo gleaming in the dim light. "What in God's name was that?" Randy whispered. "A transmission," Josh said, his eyes narrowed in thought. "Coordinates, and a name. Cross at Light." Harlan knew the name. It was a local ghost story, a piece of Ashby County folklore. The Cross at Light was a mysterious bobbing orb that was said to appear on an old abandoned logging road deep in the woods, the ghost of the railroad worker decapitated in the early 1900s. "It's a mission," Harlan said, the realization dawning on him. "It's like Charlie's Angels, but for us." "Who's Charlie?" Randy asked. "She is," Harlan said, nodding toward the stereo. He didn't know how he knew, but he was certain. The voice was their benefactor, their mysterious dispatcher. He would come to think of her as Charlene. The meaningless adventure suddenly had a purpose. It was a strange purpose, a nonsensical one, rooted in a local ghost story and delivered by a cursed stereo, but it was a purpose nonetheless. They had a destination. They had a goal. They were no longer just playing in their butt.
The coordinates Charlene had broadcasted pinpointed a location deep in the woods, miles from Harlan's holler. Walking was out of the question. "We'll take my truck," Harlan said initially, his hand instinctively going to the keys in his pocket. He was proud of his truck, a maroon 1996 Chevrolet Silverado with a long wheelbase and a light blue interior. It had been blue with a white top a long time ago. A nice truck, and he'd spent years tinkering with it, keeping the engine tuned, even building a special carrying cage for General Beauregard in the cab. It was a piece of personal history, meticulously maintained. "Are you sure about that?" Josh asked, eyeing the pristine paint job. "We're liable to be driving through thorn bushes and mud bogs, and that's before we turn into cartoons. You really want to risk scratching up the Silverado for a ghost light?" Harlan winced. Josh was right. The truck was a part of his old, predictable life. These new adventures required a different kind of vehicle, something expendable. His mind immediately went to the faded white minivan parked under a lean-to behind his sister's house a few hollers over. She had left it there a month ago when she'd gone to handle some crisis, the keys unceremoniously tossed on his kitchen table. It was a vessel of suburban decay, littered with fast food wrappers and smelling faintly of juice boxes. It was perfect. "We'll borrow the van," Harlan declared. That solved the vehicle problem, but not the driver problem. None of them felt comfortable driving while in a state of cartoonish unreality. "What about that kid down the road?" Randy suggested, "the one who couldn't make it through college. He's always looking for odd jobs." They knew the one. He lived in a neighboring holler, a young man adrift, spending his days helping his folks and maybe working part-time at a dispensary that wasn't Tommy Don's. He was quiet, reliable, and probably desperate enough for cash not to ask too many questions. The next afternoon, they drove the minivan over to the kid's house, and Harlan, as the designated leader, handled the negotiations. "We need a driver," Harlan said, leaning against the minivan's sliding door. "Evenings mostly. We'll pay you a flat rate. You drive us where we tell you wait, and you drive us back. No questions." The kid,
whose name they never quite caught, looked from their serious faces to the dilapidated minivan and back again. "Where are you going?" "That falls under the no questions part of the agreement," Josh said from the passenger seat. The kid considered it. It was weird, but it was money. "All right," he said. "I'm in." They had their chariot and their chauffeur. That evening, as the sun began to set, the four of them, Harlan, Randy, Josh, and their silent young driver, piled into the minivan. General Beauregard sat in his cage, secured to the middle seat. They gave the driver the coordinates, and the van rumbled to life, pulling out of the holler and onto the paved road, heading east. They were a strange procession. 3 aging eccentrics, a talking rooster, and a bewildered millennial, off to chase a ghost in a borrowed...
The mission took them across the invisible line that divided Ashley County. They left the rolling hills, sandy soil, and dense pine forests of the western timberlands and descended into the flat, expansive landscape of the delta. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of rich, alluvial earth and damp vegetation. Here the world opened up, the sky a vast, unbroken bowl above endless fields of cotton and soybeans. Their destination was a lonely, unmarked spot on the banks of Bayou Bartholomew, a sluggish, winding waterway that, as Harlan liked to remind everyone, was the longest bayou in the world. The driver pulled the minivan onto a muddy turnoff, the tires sinking slightly into the soft ground. "This is it," Harlan said, checking the coordinates on his phone. They got out and stood by the water's edge. The bayou was dark and mysterious, its surface like polished obsidian. Cypress trees, their bases swollen and their branches draped in Spanish moss, stood like ancient sentinels along the bank. The driver stayed in the van, wisely adhering to the no questions rule. They waited. As the clock on Harlan's phone hit 6:06 p.m., the shimmer washed over them. The delta landscape, already atmospheric, became a realm of surreal beauty. The Spanish moss glowed with a soft silver light. The dark water of the bayou swirled with iridescent purples and greens. "All right, General," Harlan said, his voice now carrying the flat, amplified quality of a cartoon character. "What's the objective?" General Beauregard, perched on a cypress knee, surveyed the scene. "The transmission specified a retrieval. The target is a cypress knee of unusual spiritual resonance. It is located approximately 30 yards downstream, guarded by spectral entities." As if on cue, the water before them began to bubble. From the depths rose a swarm of crawdads, but they were translucent, glowing with a faint blue light, their claws snapping with an audible electric crackle. They formed a protective perimeter around a single, gnarled cypress knee that pulsed with a gentle golden light. "Sentient Spanish moss, too," Josh observed, pointing up. The moss hanging from the trees was rising, coalescing into long, grasping tendrils. "A classic two-front defensive perimeter," the general noted approvingly. "Randy, you will create a diversion. Josh, you will neutralize the arboreal threat. Harlan, you will secure the objective. On my mark." What followed was 5 minutes of glorious, nonsensical chaos. Randy, using his low-gravity jumping ability, began belly-flopping into the bayou, sending up huge comical splashes that disoriented the ghost crawdads. Josh, with his extendable arms, engaged in a frantic, multi-limbed wrestling match with the sentient moss. Under the cover of this pandemonium, Harlan dashed forward, snatched the glowing cypress knee, and sprinted back to their starting point. He held the prize aloft just as the shimmer began to fade. The world snapped back to normal. The moss hung limp and inert. The water was still. The cypress knee in Harlan's hand was just a piece of damp, gnarled wood. They stood there, panting and soaked in the quiet twilight. They had faced down spectral crustaceans and animate plant life to retrieve a stick. It was the most absurd and the most exhilarating thing any of them had ever done. Back in the sanctuary of Harlan's house, the cursed stereo greeted them with the familiar strains of Half-Light. The driver had dropped him off with a single bewildered shake of his head and sped away into the night. The cypress knee sat on the kitchen table, looking profoundly ordinary. "So we risked life and limb for a piece of firewood?" Randy asked, cracking open a generic beer. "It didn't feel like firewood in a bubble. It felt important," Josh countered. Harlan wasn't listening. He was staring at the knee, a thought taking shape in his mind. He walked over to a cluttered bookshelf and pulled down a heavy, leather-bound volume, Y.W. Etheridge's History of Ashley County. He also grabbed a folder of old plat maps he'd collected over the years. He spread the maps on the table, found the coordinates Charlene had given him, and cross-referenced the location with the historical survey. His finger landed on a small, faded notation near their spot on the Bayou Bartholomew. Old Ferry Landing, circa 1850. A jolt went through him. He flipped through the Etheridge book, his fingers tracing the table of contents. He found the chapter on early transportation and began to read. The book spoke of the bayou as the first highway, the lifeblood of the early planters in the Delta, a conduit for cotton and supplies long before the railroads came. The ferry landing was a forgotten node in that old network, a place where history had happened, now reclaimed by the swamp. He looked up at his friends, his eyes bright with discovery. He said, "It's not random. None of it is." He explained his theory. The Crossed Light was a ghost story tied to the old logging railroads. The Bayou Bartholomew landing was a relic of the steamboat era. Charlene wasn't sending him on meaningless adventures. She was sending him to places of historical significance, places where the past was still alive, sleeping just beneath the surface. "Remember that wizard's proclamation?" he asked, thinking back to the strange ideas that had filled his head when this all began. The one about transferring the ambience of Earth back from the phones? Maybe this is it. Maybe the Shimmer isn't a glitch. Maybe it's a key that unlocked the ghosts of Ashley County. They weren't just a mystery crew. They were reluctant historians, accidental archaeologists of the weird. Their missions, guided by a voice from a cursed stereo, were a journey into the living memory of the land itself. The cypress knee wasn't just a piece of wood. It was an artifact, a tangible link to a forgotten time, and they were its designated custodians. The thought was both terrifying and deeply, wonderfully profound.
The next transmission came 2 nights later, another burst of static and another set of coordinates from the cryptic Charlene. This time, the location was closer to home, deep in the familiar woods of the western timberlands. The target was a specific bend in Chaminade Creek, a stream that flowed into the Bayou Bartholomew and was, according to local lore and old survey maps, the precise geographical center of Ashley County. They set out in the minivan just before sunset, the silent young man at the wheel navigating the winding dirt roads with practiced ease. They parked where the road washed out and walked the last quarter mile, the sound of the creek growing louder as they approached. It was a beautiful, secluded spot. The creek tumbled over smooth, moss-covered stones, and the canopy of pines and hardwoods formed a dense ceiling overhead. At 6:06 p.m., the Shimmer descended. The effect was different here, more intense. The colors were brighter, the sound sharper. The very air seemed to hum with a latent energy. The distortion field is stronger at this locus, General Beauregard observed from Harlan's shoulder. Proximity to the geographic meridian likely amplifies the phenomenon. "So what's the mission, General?" Randy asked, poking at a glowing iridescent mushroom with his toe. "Another magic stick to fetch?" "Negative. The objective is not retrieval, but realignment. Observe." He pointed a wing toward the creek bed. In the center of the stream, a small collection of river stones, unremarkable in the real world, now glowed with an internal blue light. They were arranged in a haphazard pile. "The harmonic resonance of this location is out of alignment," the general explained. "Your task is to rearrange those stones into a stable concentric pattern, 3 circles to be exact. It will recalibrate the local energy field." For a moment, the 3 men just stared. Their grand, mysterious mission was to engage in the world's weirdest form of landscape gardening. "You want us to stack rocks?" Josh said, his voice flat with disbelief. "Precisely. A task of utmost importance. The stability of the Shimmer may depend on it." With a collective sigh, they waded into the cool, shimmering water. The task proved more difficult than it looked. The stones were slippery, and the current, which now seemed to flow with a mischievous intelligence, kept trying to nudge them out of place. It was a slapstick ballet of slipping, stumbling men trying to arrange glowing rocks while a rooster offered unhelpful advice from the bank. Finally, after several minutes of fumbling, they managed it. The last stone was placed, completing the 3rd concentric circle. The moment it settled, the blue glow of the stones intensified, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. A visible ripple, like a heat haze, passed through them and disappeared into the woods. The humming stopped. "Realignment complete," the general announced, preening a feather. "A job well done, gentlemen." The shimmer faded a moment later, leaving them standing knee-deep in a perfectly normal creek, staring at a pile of perfectly normal, non-glowing rocks. They hadn't retrieved anything. They hadn't fought any spectral monsters, but as they walked back to the minivan in the gathering dark, they all felt it. A subtle shift, a sense that they had done more than just stack rocks. They had tuned an invisible instrument, and the music was just beginning. Charlene's next set of coordinates sent them south, toward the Louisiana border, to a place that existed more in memory than on any modern map. Hamburg Landing on the Murray-Saline River. In the mid-19th century, it had been a bustling little port, but the railroads had killed the river traffic, and the landing had slowly rotted back into the wilderness. All that remained were a few crumbling pilings in a clearing overgrown with kudzu. Their mission, according to the static-laced transmission, was to neutralize a historical belligerent. "Doesn't sound friendly," Randy muttered as they waited for the shimmer. When the world transformed, the clearing was no longer empty. A crude, cartoonish building stood before them. A 7x9 grocery with a crooked porch and a sign that read, "Files Provisions." A figure stood on the porch, a caricature of a wild-eyed desperado with a huge mustache and 2 oversized pistols tucked into his belt. "That's our man," General Beauregard whispered. "Files, a notorious character from the Reconstruction era. According to the historical record, he was accused of stockpiling munitions for an insurrection." The cartoon Files spotted him. "State militia!" he shrieked, his voice a high-pitched squawk. "You'll never take my goods. They're for the good people of Ashley County."
He ducked inside the grocery. A moment later, the door flew open and he began rolling out barrels. They weren't barrels of flour or pickles. They were cartoon barrels with powder stenciled on the side in big block letters. 1,400 pounds of black powder and 2 cases of double-barreled shotguns, if the archives are correct, the general noted calmly. He intends to detonate 'em, a significant temporal disruption. So we stop him? Harlan asked. Indeed, this calls for a flanking maneuver. The battle for Hamburg Landing was short, chaotic, and utterly ridiculous. Josh used his extendable arms to snatch the pistols from Files's belt from 50 feet away. Randy, with his low-gravity leaps, bounded onto the roof of the grocery to create a diversion. Harlan, meanwhile, was tasked with the main objective, rolling the powder kegs down the bank and into the spectral waters of the Murray-Saline River. Files, disarmed but furious, chased Harlan around the clearing, shaking his fists and spouting a stream of comical 19th century curses. Harlan, a retired man in his late 60s, found himself in a life-or-death chase with a historical ghost, pushing a keg of imaginary gunpowder. With a final desperate shove, he sent the last barrel tumbling into the river, where it sank with a satisfying plump. Defeated, the ghost of Files stumped his foot, faded into transparency, and vanished. The grocery store wavered and dissolved. The shimmer ended. They were alone again in the overgrown clearing. Harlan leaned against a tree, catching his breath. He had just gone toe-to-toe with a footnote from an old history book. The past, he was learning, was a surprisingly rowdy place.
The minivan bumped along a dirt track, cutting across a wide, open expanse known locally as Fountain Prairie. It was one of several such grasslands in the western part of the county, remnants of a landscape that predated the endless forests. The prairie was not flat. It was dotted with dozens of low, rounded humps, enigmatic features the old-timers called prairie mounds. Geologists and archaeologists had argued for a century about their origin. Were they natural formations, the result of ancient seismic activity or erosion, or were they the work of some forgotten prehistoric people? Charlene's latest message had been simple. A set of coordinates in the middle of the prairie, and the single word, soothe. They reached the spot and waited. The sun set and the shimmer arrived, washing the prairie in ethereal light. The mounds changed. They were no longer just humps of earth and grass. In the hyperreal light of a bubble, they took on a new form. They were immense, sleeping creatures, their bodies curled up just beneath the surface of the land, their grassy backs rising and falling with a slow, deep, rhythmic breath. "Well," Randy said, his voice full of awe, "I guess that settles the geology debate." One of the mounds, the one directly in front of them, was trembling. The ground around it vibrated, and a low, mournful groaning sound emanated from deep within the earth. This one is distressed. It is experiencing a nightmare. If it awakens in this state, the resulting seismic disturbance could register as a minor earthquake in the exterior world. "So what do we do?" Harlan asked, staring at the trembling hill. "Sing it a lullaby?" "A similar principle applies," the general confirmed. "The creature must be reminded of its long, peaceful history. You must act as conduits for the memory of the land." And so they began. Harlan, Randy, and Josh, 3 cartoon figures in a shimmering landscape, circled the trembling mound. Randy hummed an old drinking song. Josh a mournful folk ballad. Harlan, unable to think of anything else, hummed the only song that had been in his head for weeks, "Half Light." They walked and hummed, their hands trailing in the glowing grass. Slowly, miraculously, the trembling lessened. The mournful groaning softened into a deep, contented sigh. The mound settled into a peaceful, rhythmic breathing that matched its sleeping brethren. The shimmer faded, leaving them standing in the dark on a quiet, motionless prairie. They had averted a cartoon earthquake by humming to a hill. Harlan looked out at the dark shapes of the mounds sleeping under the stars. The world was so much stranger and so much more wonderful than he had ever imagined. The ancient, silent land had its own dreams, and for a few brief moments they had been allowed to listen.
Longview, in the northwest corner of the county, was another ghost. Situated on a high bluff overlooking the Saline River, it had once been a vital antebellum transportation hub, the main river port for Ashley, Drew, and Bradley counties. Steamboats had plied the waters, and a Confederate pontoon bridge had made it a strategic crossing during the Civil War. But the railroads had choked it, and now, like Hamburg Landing, it was little more than a name on an old map and the site of a minor historical skirmish. It was to this skirmish that Charlene's next mission directed them. The coordinates led to the old landing, and the message was a single ominous phrase: enforce the truce. When the Shimmer descended at 6:06 p.m., the landing was no longer quiet. It was a scene of cartoon chaos. A group of blue-clad Union cavalrymen, their faces masks of goofy determination, were locked in a slapstick battle with a band of gray-clad Confederates. The Union objective was a spectral, half-finished pontoon bridge that shimmered over the river. The Confederates, hopelessly outnumbered, were defending it with comical ineptitude. A Union soldier would charge, trip over his own saber, and slide headfirst into a mud puddle. A Confederate would try to fire his rifle, only to have it backfire, covering his face in soot. It was a battle fought with the logic of a Saturday morning cartoon, and it had apparently been raging every evening at 6:06 p.m. for over 150 years. The historical event has become stuck, General Beauregard explained, surveying the scene from a safe distance. A temporal loop. Your mission is to mediate a cessation of hostilities. We're supposed to be diplomats? Randy asked, ducking as a stray, slow-moving cannonball sailed overhead with a whistling sound effect. Precisely. You must convince both commanders to stand down. Harlan, Randy, and Josh, now the reluctant peacekeepers of the Civil War, split up. Harlan approached the Union commander, a lieutenant with an enormous chin and a frazzled expression. "Sir," Harlan began, "we're here to ask you to cease your attack." "Can't do it," the lieutenant squawked. "Got my orders from Colonel Clayton himself. Destroy that bridge. It's a brilliant raid, almost without parallel." His words were a direct, if frantic, quote from the historical record. Meanwhile, Josh and Randy tried to reason with the Confederate leader, who was hiding behind a rain barrel. "Y'all have to surrender. You're outnumbered. You've been outnumbered since 1864. "Never," the Confederate shouted. "We must protect the supplies. We must hold the landing." The negotiations were going nowhere. The farcical battle raged around them. Finally, General Beauregard had an idea. He declared, "The objective is the bridge. If the objective is removed, the conflict becomes moot." Following his instructions, Josh stretched his arms across the river, grabbed the end of the spectral pontoon bridge, and gave a mighty heave. With a sound like tearing silk, the bridge detached from the far bank and swung downstream, where it dissolved into the shimmering water. Both armies stopped fighting. They stared at the empty space where the bridge had been. Their entire purpose for being there was gone. The Union commander looked at the Confederate commander. They shrugged. Then, in unison, they and their men simply faded away, their century-long conflict finally rendered pointless.
The Shimmer ended. The landing was quiet once more. The crew had brought priests to Longview, not with treaties or speeches, but with the simple, absurd logic of a cartoon.
A sputtering cough from the minivan's engine, followed by a plume of acrid smoke, brought their next mission to an unscheduled halt. They were still miles from their destination when the van died completely, rolling to a stop on the shoulder of US 425, just on the outskirts of Hamburg. "Well," the driver said, turning the key to a chorus of useless clicks, "I think that's it for her." They were stranded. The sun was setting, and the clock was ticking toward 6:06. Their only option was to walk into town and find a mechanic in the morning. They trudged into Hamburg, the county seat, a town of brick storefronts and old fabled houses that stood in stark contrast to the utilitarian architecture across it, the industrial giant 15 miles to the west. They were standing on the courthouse square arguing about where to find a motel when the Shimmer hit. The world transformed, but this time they were not in the wilderness. The brick buildings of the square wavered, their lines softening into a cartoonish version of a late 19th century town. The people around them, the few late evening shoppers and courthouse workers, vanished, replaced by figures in period dress, men in bowler hats and women in long skirts. "We're in the past," Harlan breathed. They watched as a group of stern-looking men in suits, the ghostly echoes of Hamburg's civic leaders, gathered on the courthouse steps. Another group of men, looking equally determined but out of place in their rougher northern-style clothes, approached them. "We are witnessing a formative event," General Beauregard spoke from inside Harlan's jacket, "the Crosset Overture." The crew listened, invisible observers to a pivotal moment in their county's history. They heard the northern investors, the founders of what would become the Crosset Lumber Company, make their proposal to build the largest sawmill in the South right there in Hamburg. They spoke of jobs, of progress, of a railroad spur. Then they heard the Hamburg leaders reply. The voice of the lead councilman was dripping with condescension. He spoke of preserving their town's character, of not wanting an influx of foreign sawmill people. He worried about competition for labor, about the disruption to their established agriculture-based society. The rejection was polite but firm and utterly dismissive. The northern investors stood in stunned silence for a moment, then turned and walked away, their faces set with a new, harder determination. The Shimmer faded, leaving the crew alone on the shimmering empty square. "They turned them down," Randy said, bewildered. "They turned down the biggest thing that ever happened to this county." "And in doing so, they created Crosset," Harlan finished, the pieces clicking into place. "If they had said yes, Crosset would just be a neighborhood in Hamburg. There'd be no rivalry, no two different worlds in one county." Their mission, they realized, had been simply to bear witness, to ensure this moment of pride and prejudice unfolded as it was meant to. The breakdown of the minivan hadn't been an accident, it had been a summons. They had been called to observe the birth of the dual identity that had shaped their home for over a century, the old established county seat and the raw and powerful company town born from its rejection.
After a night in a musty Hamburg motel, they got the minivan running again. "A loose battery cable," the mechanic said with a shrug. Charlene's coordinates remained unvisited, so they set out again, hidden deep into the pine forest west of Crosset, into the heart of what was once the vast timber holdings of the Crosset Lumber Company. The destination was a clearing in the woods, marked only by a few rotten railroad ties and the faint outline of a forgotten road. This, according to Harlan's historical maps, was the site of a former logging camp, one of the so-called contentment camps the company had established in the 1920s to bring a semblance of civilization to the rough-and-tumble world of the loggers. When the Shimmer arrived, the clearing was transformed. A small, bustling town of rough-hewn but sturdy wooden buildings appeared around them. A dining hall, a company store, a small schoolhouse, and rows of simple houses, all painted a uniform utilitarian gray. Spectral loggers in suspenders and heavy boots walk the muddy streets, their voices a low murmur. A steam locomotive sat hissing on a nearby track, waiting to haul its load of pine logs to the mill. The objective is to prevent a fire. A stray spark from the locomotive smokestack is about to ignite the roof of the schoolhouse. You must intervene, General Beauregard announced. The crew sprang into action. The locomotive let out a great puff of smoke, and just as the general had predicted, a single oversized cartoon spark floated through the air, heading directly for the school's dry wooden shingles. What followed was a frantic three-man bucket brigade. But there was no water. Instead, they had to use whatever they could find. Randy, discovering a spectral pickle barrel outside the commissary, began grabbing handfuls of enormous, dripping pickles and hurling them at the roof. Josh, using his extendable arms, climbed a pine tree and tried to swat the spark out of the air with a large branch. Harlan, meanwhile, ran into the schoolhouse. It was empty, save for a single spectral school teacher grading papers at her desk. She didn't seem to notice him. On the wall, a chalkboard had a list of spelling words: loblolly, turpentine, crosscut, paternalism. He saw a fire extinguisher on the wall, a primitive brass-colored pump model. He grabbed it, ran back outside, and aimed it at the roof. With a mighty heave on the pump, he unleashed a torrent of pure, concentrated absurdity. A stream of brightly colored confetti and rubber chickens that harmlessly smothered the spark just as it landed. The locomotive whistled, the spectral loggers went about their business, and the schoolhouse was safe. Their mission was complete. As the shimmer faded, Harlan stood for a moment looking at the ghostly town. He thought of the men who lived here, deep in the woods, their lives dictated by the company whistle. It was a hard life, but as the camp's name suggested, it was also a community, a world unto itself. They were just another layer of ghosts in a county full of them.
The voice on the stereo sent them to a small, forgotten cemetery on a ridge near Fountain Hill, one of the oldest settlements in the county. The graves were marked with simple, weathered stones, the names of pioneer families, Denson, Norris, Kirkpatrick, barely legible after more than a century of wind and rain. The mission was vague: provide counsel. The shimmer fell upon the quiet graveyard, and a figure appeared among the tombstones. He was a tall, gaunt man with a wild beard and fire in his eyes, dressed in the homespun clothes of an antebellum preacher. He looked at the cartoonish forms of Harlan, Randy, and Josh, and his face was a mask of awe and terror. "Apparitions!" he cried, his voice a booming circuit rider's bellow. "Have you come from the celestial heights to bring tidings of salvation, or have you crawled from the sulphurous pits to tempt the souls of this congregation?" General Beauregard stepped forward. "We are emissaries of a higher authority, Reverend. We are here to assist you." The preacher, Harlan realized with a jolt, was the ghost of Hogan Allen, a prominent pioneer preacher mentioned in the old Goodspeed's memoirs. According to the book, he was a man of great piety and originality, known for his unconventional interpretations of the Bible. "The Lord has sent you then," Allen boomed, "for my flock is troubled. A question of Scripture has divided them, and their faith is shaken." The preacher explained the theological crisis. A dispute had broken out over the story of the ravens that fed Elijah. A skeptic in his flock had posed a vexing question. How did the ravens propagate after the one was sent from Noah's Ark and never returned? It was a nonsensical question, but it had planted a seed of doubt that was threatening to tear his spectral congregation apart.
"We need an answer," the preacher pleaded, "a sign to restore their faith." The crew was stumped. They were experts in cheap beer and cartoon physics, not avian theology. They looked to General Beauregard. The rooster puffed out his chest. "Reverend," he began, his voice filled with an unearned authority, "the answer is simple, a matter of basic ornithological logistics. At the time the raven was sent from the ark, the old hen was setting." The preacher stared at him. The logic was absurd, childish, and utterly indefensible. It was also, in its own strange way, perfect. A smile broke across his face. "Of course," he roared, slapping his thigh, "the simple truth delivered by a celestial fowl. My flock will be saved." He thanked them profusely, his faith restored by a piece of nonsensical barnyard wisdom. As he faded with the shimmering light, he was already rehearsing his next sermon, a triumphant vindication of Scripture. Harlan and his friends walked back to the minivan in silence. They had just prevented a schism in a ghost church by telling a bad joke. "Provide counsel," Charlene had said. Apparently, in the world of the Shimmer, that's exactly what they had done.
The next mission took them to the far eastern edge of the county, to the sprawling, swampy expanse of the Overflow National Wildlife Refuge. It was a world away from their piney woods, a flat, wet landscape of bottomland hardwoods, sloughs, and flooded timber, a haven for waterfowl on the Mississippi Flyway. The air was thick with the buzz of insects and the calls of unseen birds. The transmission had been unusually stark. Contain the asset. They lost a small John boat Harlan kept strapped to the top of the minivan and mowed it into the refuge's watery maze. They found a spot designated by the coordinates, a secluded lake choked with water lilies and cypress stumps, and waited. When the Shimmer hit, the refuge transformed into a primeval cartoon paradise. The water sparkled with impossible blues, and the cypress trees were draped in glowing emerald moss. But something was wrong. The water was churning, and a sound like a freight train was echoing across the lake. A huge serpentine head as big as the front of the minivan erupted from the water. It was a mythical beast, a cross between a dragon and an alligator, with glowing red eyes and a mournful expression. It lit out a definite war of frustration. "That," General Beauregard stated from the bow of the boat, "is the asset, the spirit of the bayou. It appears to be stuck." The creature was indeed stuck. Its long serpentine body was hopelessly tangled in a massive spectral beaver dam that stretched across the far end of the lake. Every time it thrashed, the dam only seemed to tighten its grip. "Beavers," Josh muttered, shaking his head. "Even the ghost ones are a nuisance. Our objective is to free the creature before its struggles cause a tidal surge that could flood half the spectral plane," the general commanded. The task seemed impossible. The dam was a tangled mess of glowing logs and mud, and the beast was panicking. But the crew had a plan. Or rather, Randy had an idea. "Music," he said. "They say music soothes the savage beast." Harlan pulled out his flip phone, which he'd synced to a small Bluetooth speaker. He found the only song on it, the only song in his world, "Half Light." As the melancholy, shimmering notes of the song drifted across the water, the great beast stopped thrashing. It turned its huge head, its red eyes blinking slowly. It seemed to listen, captivated by the melody. While the creature was distracted, Josh used his extendable arms to begin carefully untangling the logs of the dam, while Harlan and Randy used paddles to push him away. It was slow, delicate work. The song ended and started again, over and over, the only sound in the swamp besides the gentle lapping of water and the creak of spectral wood. Finally, with one last log removed, the beast was free. It swam a slow, graceful circle around their boat, dipped its massive head in a gesture of thanks, and then dove deep into the shimmering water,
disappearing without a trace. The shimmer faded. The lake was still. The only evidence of their encounter was the endless song still playing from the speaker. They had tamed a mythical monster with a curse pop song.
They had grown comfortable with the Shimmer, with their role as the secret, bumbling custodians of Ashley County's weirdness. Their missions were strange, but they were theirs alone. That was about to change. It happened during a simple mission near Milo, a small community between Hamburg and Longview. They were tasked with finding a spectral beehive and harvesting a single drop of its glowing ambrosial honey. They were halfway through the task, with Randy distracting the cartoonishly large bees while Josh reached for the honeycomb, when another group appeared at the edge of the clearing. There were 3 of them, and they shimmered with the same cartoonish energy as Harlan's crew. But their energy was different, jagged, chaotic, and mean. Their leader was a burly man with a cruel, smirking face. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a low growl. "Look what we have here. Some old-timers playing in our sandbox." Harlan and his friends froze. They had never considered that they might not be the only ones. "This is our territory," the man continued, stepping forward. His 2 cronies fanned out behind him. "We found the Shimmer. We make the rules." "We were not aware of any established territorial claims," General Beauregard said stiffly from his perch on a branch. The rival leader laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A talking chicken. Cute." He snapped his fingers. "We'll be taking that honey, old man." Harlan's crew was not built for conflict. They were mediators, gardeners, and beast soothers. But they were also stubborn. "Find your own honey," Harlan said, his voice steady. The rival crew charged. The fight was a whirlwind of cartoon violence. The rivals were stronger and more ruthless, their movements honed for a fight. They threw comical, oversized punches and moved with a brutal efficiency. Harlan's crew was quickly overwhelmed. The leader snatched the honeycomb from Josh, took the glowing drop of honey for himself, and smashed the rest on the ground. "This is your only warning. Stay out of our way." As the shimmer faded, Harlan, Randy, and Josh were left bruised, battered, and shaken. Their secret world had been invaded. The game had suddenly become dangerous. For the first time, they had an enemy.
The presence of the rival crew changed everything. The Shimmer was no longer a private playground. It was a contested space. The missions became tense, fraught with the possibility of another confrontation. The rivals seemed to be everywhere, their motives unclear. They weren't interested in completing the missions. They were interested in chaos and using their cartoon abilities for petty theft and vandalism within the bubble. Their reckless actions began to have consequences. The bubble, which had always been a stable, self-contained reality, started to fray at the edges. Glitches began to appear. During a mission to retrieve a spectral land grant from the original county courthouse in Hamburg, the rival crew showed up and started a brawl. In the chaos, a cartoon anvil dropped from a cartoon roof by one of the rivals didn't just hit the ground with a comical clang, it smashed through the spectral pavement and kept going, leaving a shimmering, jagged crack in the fabric of the bubble. For a terrifying moment, the real world bled through. Harlan could see the normal evening traffic on the real Hamburg Square through the crack, the headlights of the cars ghostly and strange. The people in the cars couldn't see them, but the barrier between worlds had been weakened. The glitches grew more frequent and more alarming. A spectral Civil War cannonball, knocked off course during a rival-instigated skirmish at Longview,
phased partially into the real world, appearing for a split second as a silent, ghostly orb that terrified a group of teenagers parked by the river. A cartoon fire set by the rivals in the spectral contentment camp caused a patch of real-world forest to become unexplicably, unnaturally hot for a few minutes. Harlan realized the danger. The rivals weren't just disrupting their missions, they were destabilizing the Shimmer itself. Their selfish, chaotic actions were threatening to tear a hole between the two realities. Their interference is causing recursive errors in the distortion field, General Beauregard explained grimly one evening. If this continues, the bubble will collapse. The consequences of such a collapse are unpredictable and likely catastrophic. The stakes had been raised exponentially. This was no longer about retrieving historical artifacts or soothing sleeping giants. It was about protecting the very fabric of their world, both the real and the magical. They had to stop the rival crew, not just to reclaim their secret adventures, but to prevent a disaster they were only beginning to comprehend. The rivalry simmered, a low-grade war of ambush and sabotage fought in the twilight hours. Harlan's crew learned to be cautious, to post lookouts, to finish their tasks with a new sense of urgency. The missions from Charlene continued, relentless and cryptic, as if unaware of the conflict brewing on the ground. One evening, a transmission sent them to a place steeped in the county's industrial past, the sawmill holler. It was a deep, narrow valley that had once housed a small, independent sawmill in the days before the Crossett Lumber Company dominated the landscape. The mill was long gone, but the ghosts of its industry remained. The Shimmer transformed the holler into a cacophony of spectral activity, the air filled with the high-pitched whine of a phantom saw blade and the shouts of ghostly mill workers. Huge, translucent logs floating down a dry creek bed, guided by men with spectral PVs. "The objective is to clear a log jam," General Beauregard announced over the din. "A temporal blockage is preventing the flow of historical energy." At the narrowest point of the holler, a massive pile of spectral logs had jammed, creating a dam that was causing the energy of the bubble to back up, making the air thick and hard to breathe. As they approached the jam, the rival crew appeared on the ridge above them, their smirking leader looking down. "Playing with logs, old-timers, leave the heavy lifting to us." Before Harlan's crew could react, the rivals started rolling huge spectral boulders down the hillside, not at the log jam, but at them. It was a direct, unambiguous attack. Harlan, Randy, and Josh scrambled for cover as the cartoon boulders bounced and crashed around them. The mission was forgotten. This was about survival. The holler became a chaotic battlefield. Josh used his long arms to bat smaller boulders back up the hill. Randy, using his low-gravity jumps, leaped from log to log trying to get to a better position. Harlan, armed with a heavy piece of spectral timber, tried to hold his ground. It was a losing fight. The rivals had the high ground and the element of surprise. The leader of the rival crew laughed, preparing to roll one last enormous boulder that would surely end the fight. But he had forgotten about the fourth member of Harlan's team. General Beauregard, who had been observing the battle from a high branch, let out a piercing crow. It wasn't his usual morning call. It was a sharp, commanding battle cry. He launched himself from the tree and flew directly at the rival leader's face, a flurry of feathers and righteous fury. The man, startled by the sudden attack from a talking rooster, stumbled backward, lost his footing, and tumbled head over heels down the ridge, landing in a heap at the bottom. His two cronies, seeing their leader taken out by a bantam rooster, hesitated for a moment and then turned and fled into the woods. The battle to Sawmill Holler was over. General Beauregard landed on Harlan's shoulder, puffed out his chest, and declared,
superior aerial tactics will prevail every time.